The heavy brass key felt like a block of ice in Clara's palm. She was 32 weeks pregnant, her lower back radiating a dull, exhausting ache that had become her constant companion. In her other arm, she balanced a shopping bag containing soft organic cotton swaddles, tiny garments meant for the son she and Julian had supposedly prayed for. Clara pushed open the massive oak door of their Hamptons estate, expecting the usual pristine silence of her heavily curated life. The foyer, bathed in the soft glow of designer chandeliers, was flawless. Julian Vance, billionaire CEO of Vance Global, demanded a flawless life. For 7 years, Clara had been the exhausted architect of that perfection. She managed his diets, his galas, his demanding family, and his temper. She had hollowed herself out to make room for his colossal ego. She kicked off her flat shoes, her swollen feet throbbing in protest against the cold marble floor. She just wanted a bath. She just wanted to feel her baby kick in the quiet sanctuary of her nursery. But the sanctuary was already occupied. It wasn't a loud noise. It was the soft, unmistakable clinking of crystal glasses, followed by a low, throaty laugh that made the blood freeze in Clara's veins. It was a woman's laugh, confident, entitled. It was coming from the sunroom, the room Clara had painstakingly decorated as a quiet reading nook for her maternity leave. Clara's hand instinctively went to her heavy belly. Her heart began to hammer a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. The air suddenly felt too thick to breathe. She moved down the hallway, her bare feet making no sound on the imported rugs. As she neared the arched doorway of the sunroom, a heavy, overpowering scent hit her. Amber and sharp musk. It wasn't the subtle lavender Clara wore, it was aggressive. She stopped just short of the archway, her fingers digging into the plaster wall for support. Through the glass panes of the French doors, she saw them. Julian was leaning against the edge of the velvet sofa, his expensive tailored jacket discarded on the floor. His tie was loosened, his dark hair usually perfectly styled, mussed in a way Clara hadn't seen since their honeymoon. Standing between his legs was Vivian Croft. Clara knew Vivian. Everyone in Julian's orbit knew Vivian. She was the newly appointed director of acquisitions at Vance Global. She was 28, razor sharp, and looked at Julian not as a boss, but as a prize to be won. Right now, Vivian was wearing a silk slip dress that left absolutely nothing to the imagination, her hands casually resting on Julian's chest as she tipped her head back to accept his kiss. The swaddle slipped from Clara's arm. The paper bag hit the hardwood floor with a soft, pathetic thud. Julian's head snapped up. For a single suspended second, the three of them were frozen in a horrific tableau. Clara saw the immediate flash of panic in Julian's striking silver gray eyes, but it vanished almost instantly, replaced by a cold, hardened mask of annoyance. He didn't scramble away. He didn't drop to his knees. He simply sighed a harsh sound of deep inconvenience. Vivian turned slowly, her manicured fingers still tracing the lapel of Julian's shirt. She looked at Clara's pale face, then deliberately let her gaze travel down to Clara's swollen, heavy belly. A slow, wicked smirk touched the corner of Vivian's mouth. There was no shame in her eyes. There was only victory. Clara, Julian said. His voice was incredibly steady, the same voice he used to negotiate hostile corporate takeovers. You weren't supposed to be back from the city until tomorrow. The sheer audacity of the statement struck Clara like a physical blow. She stood there feeling massive, exhausted, and utterly discarded. Her entire life, her marriage, the vows spoken in a cathedral 7 years ago, it was all evaporating in the heavy amber-scented air. I had a mild cramping episode, Clara whispered. Her voice sounded thin like dry leaves breaking. The doctor advised me to come home and rest. Oh, poor thing, Vivian cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She finally stepped away from Julian, picking up her crystal glass from the side table. Pregnancy looks so exhausting on you, Clara. You really should be resting. Clara ignored her. Her eyes were locked on the man whose child was currently pressing heavily against her ribs. In our home, Julian, Clara's voice shook, though she fought desperately to keep it level. In the room we built for our son. Julian ran a hand through his hair, his posture exuding irritation. Let's not do this right now, Clara. Please. You're hormonal. You're emotional. It's just stress relief. Vivian and I have been working 70-hour weeks on the Tokyo merger. Stress relief? Clara repeated the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. It means nothing, Julian continued, taking a step toward her. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, treating her like a volatile child. You are my wife. You are carrying my heir. Nothing changes that. But you have been distant, obsessed with the pregnancy. A man has needs, Clara. Let's act like adults. Go upstairs and take your bath, and we will talk about this logically in the morning. He was using their unborn child as a shield while simultaneously blaming her for his betrayal. He viewed this entirely as a transaction, a minor glitch in his otherwise perfect ecosystem. Vivian took a sip of her drink. He's right, Clara. Don't make a scene. It's bad for the baby's heart rate. A sudden sharp pain flared in Clara's lower back, radiating around her abdomen. The baby was kicking a frantic rolling movement that mirrored the absolute chaos inside her. For 7 years, Clara had compromised. She had smiled for the cameras hosted. His demanding mother ignored his late nights and convinced herself it was all for the sake of their family. She looked at Julian, really looked at him. Beneath the bespoke suit and the billionaire charm, she saw a terrifying void. He felt no remorse. He only felt inconvenience that his two worlds had collided. If she stayed, this would be her son's baseline for love. Her child would grow up in a cold, beautiful glass house, learning that betrayal was acceptable and women were expendable. A profound, icy calm washed over Clara. The exhaustion that had plagued her for 32 weeks suddenly vanished, replaced by a fierce, primal instinct. "You're right, Julian," Clara said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. Julian's shoulders relaxed slightly. A smug, victorious glint appeared in his silver-gray eyes. He thought he had won. He thought she was capitulating as she always did. "I am carrying your heir," Clara continued, taking a slow step backward into the hallway. "And that is exactly why I am not going upstairs." Julian frowned, the annoyance returning to his features. "Clara, stop being dramatic. Where are you going?" Clara bent down, groaning slightly as she retrieved the drop bag of swaddles. She held it against her chest. She looked at Vivian, who was now watching her with narrowed eyes, and then back to Julian. "I am going to make sure my son never learns what it means to be a Vance," Clara said. She turned her back on them. She didn't scream. She didn't throw the crystal glasses. She didn't beg for the love of a man who had none to give. She simply walked away, her steps heavy but purposeful. "Clara!" Julian's voice cracked like a whip through the hallway. "If you walk out that door right now acting like a hysterical pregnant woman, do not expect me to come chasing after you. I don't have time for your tantrums." Clara reached the heavy oak door. Outside, the sky had bruised into a deep, violent purple. The first heavy drops of a summer storm were beginning to shatter against the glass windows. She didn't look back. She pushed the door open and stepped out into the biting wind and the rain. The cold water instantly soaked through her thin maternity blouse, but she didn't care. With every step she took down the long, sweeping driveway, the suffocating grip of Julian Vance loosened. She walked toward the heavy wrought iron gates, leaving the keys to her Range Rover on the entryway console. She didn't want his cars. She didn't want his money. As the rain washed away the scent of amber perfume and the sterile air of the Hamptons estate, Clara placed both hands firmly on her belly. "It's just you and me now, little one," she whispered into the storm. "I will hide you from him until the end of the earth if I have to. I promise." She vanished into the rain, taking the billionaire's hidden air with her. The rain in the Hamptons that evening was not a gentle summer shower. It was a deluge, a violent downpour that felt like the sky itself was weeping for the death of Clara's marriage. By the time she reached the end of the long, winding driveway and passed through the towering, wrought iron gates of the Vance estate, she was drenched to the bone. Her thin maternity blouse clung to her shivering frame, and her sodden hair whipped across her pale face. Every step was a monumental effort. At 32 weeks pregnant, her center of gravity had shifted entirely, pulling painfully at her lower back. The chill of the rain seeped into her joints, and a series of sharp Braxton Hicks contractions tightened her abdomen, forcing her to stop and lean heavily against the cold stone pillar of the gate. She wrapped her arms protectively around her belly, whispering soothing words to her unborn son over the roar of the wind. "I've got you," she murmured, her teeth chattering. "I've got you, Leo." She had secretly chosen the name weeks ago, a name meaning lion, brave and strong. A name Julian had scoffed at, preferring something regal, something that sounded like a corporate asset. But he wasn't a Vance asset anymore. He was Leo, her Leo. A pair of headlights cut through the blinding rain. It was a local taxi, likely heading back into the town after a drop-off. Clara stepped out just enough to be seen raising a trembling hand. The cab skidded to a halt on the wet asphalt. She pulled open the heavy door and climbed into the back seat. The worn vinyl, a stark contrast to the plush leather of the luxury SUVs she was used to. Montauk Station, Clara told the driver, handing him a soaked $50 bill from her pocket. Please hurry. She huddled in the corner of the cab, staring out the window as the opulent mansions of the Hamptons blurred into gray streaks. She unclasped the heavy diamond necklace Julian had given her for their anniversary, a collar of ownership, and shoved it deep into her wet purse. Then her trembling fingers found her smartphone. She powered it down, popped the SIM card tray open with an earring, and let the tiny chip fall onto the floorboard of the cab. In the world of billionaires, a cell phone was a tracking beacon. Mrs. Julian Vance was officially off the grid. The train ride into Manhattan was a blur of exhaustion and cold. Clara sat in the corner of a dimly lit car, wrapped in a coarse, dry blanket a kind conductor had handed her. Her body ached with a profound, bone-deep weariness, but her mind was running with terrifying clarity. Julian had vastly underestimated her. He assumed that because she had been quiet, compliant, and focused on managing his home, she was weak. He didn't realize that managing a man like Julian Vance required strategic brilliance and nerves of steel. Arriving at Penn Station, she blended into the late-night crowds. She bypassed the luxury hotels where her face would be recognized and instead hailed a yellow cab to a nondescript cash-only motel in Queens. Once inside the locking door of the dingy room, peeling out of her wet clothes and wrapping herself in a threadbare towel, she allowed herself to cry. Not for Julian, but for the shattered illusion of the family she thought she was building. She cried for her son who would be born without a father. When the tears finally stopped, she put on the motel's complimentary robe and picked up the cheap burner phone she had purchased at a bodega across the street. She dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang twice before a deep, alert voice answered. Sterling. Arthur. Clara breathed, her voice raspy. Clara? Arthur Sterling's tone shifted instantly from professional edge to sharp protective alarm. Arthur had been her closest friend at Columbia University long before Julian Vance had swept in and consumed her life. He was now one of the most ruthless and brilliant family law attorneys in New York City. Where are you? Your personal phone is dead. I've been trying to reach you. I left him, Arthur, she said softly. The words felt incredibly heavy yet liberating. I caught him with Vivian Croft in our house, in the sunroom. A heavy silence fell over the line, followed by a dark, furious exhale. That arrogant son of a bitch. Are you safe? Is the baby okay? Tell me where you are. I'm coming to get you. I'm safe and the baby is fine, just tired. I'm in a motel in Queens. Arthur, he thinks I'm throwing a tantrum. He thinks I'll crawl back when I run out of money. Clara looked down at her swollen belly, her hand resting over the spot where Leo was kicking gently. I need to initiate the protocol. Arthur didn't hesitate. For the past 2 years, noticing Julian's escalating narcissism and controlling behavior, Arthur had advised Clara to prepare an exit strategy. Slowly, methodically, she had been moving money, her own money, from a trust her grandmother had left her untouched by Julian's prenuptial agreement into a secure, untraceable offshore account under her maiden name, Hayes. Consider it done, Arthur said firmly. First thing tomorrow, I'm wiring the funds to the secondary accounts. You will have access by noon. I'm also locking down your medical records so his people can't track your prenatal care. Clara, you have to disappear completely. If he finds you before the baby is born, he has the resources to make your life a living hell with emergency injunctions. I know, Clara said, staring at the peeling wallpaper. I'm leaving New York. I'm going far away. I just need you to hold the line here. I will build a fortress, Clara, Arthur promised, his voice a comforting anchor in her chaotic night. Rest. Tomorrow we erase Mrs. Vance. While Clara fought for her survival in a cold motel room, Julian Vance awoke the next morning in his king-sized bed to the sound of torrential rain still hammering against the glass windows of his Hamptons estate. He reached across the expansive mattress, expecting to feel Clara's warm, pregnant form. His hand met only smooth, cool silk sheets. He opened his eyes, a frown creasing his forehead. He sat up, the events of the previous evening washing over him. The confrontation. Clara walking out into the storm. He rolled his eyes, throwing off the duvet. Unbelievable, he muttered. Julian walked to the window, looking down at the driveway. Clara's Range Rover was still there, parked exactly where she always left it. He let out a short, cynical laugh. She hadn't even taken a car. She was probably at her friend Sarah's house in town, crying and waiting for him to call and apologize. Women like Clara, dependent, nesting, heavily pregnant, did not simply walk away from a $1 billion empire. She was punishing and making a point. He turned toward the ensuite bathroom, expecting to take a hot shower, and ordered his assistant to send Clara a massive bouquet of peonies and a diamond tennis bracelet. That was how these things were handled, a transaction to smooth over a temporary disruption. But as he walked into the hallway, the scent of sharp amber musk hit him again. "Morning, Julian," Vivian purred. Julian stopped dead in his tracks. Vivian was walking up the grand staircase wearing one of Clara's expensive cashmere robes. She was holding a mug of coffee, looking entirely too comfortable in a house that belonged to his wife. "What are you still doing here?" Julian asked, his voice tighter than he intended. Vivian paused, her smirk faltering slightly before she recovered. "It was pouring. I didn't want to drive all the way back to the city in the dark. Besides, I thought you might need some company, since your wife decided to abandon her post." She brushed past him, her hand trailing along his bare chest. Julian felt a sudden, unexpected spike of irritation. Vivian was thrilling in the boardroom and intoxicating in a hotel room, but seeing her here, drinking from Clara's favorite ceramic mug, felt profoundly wrong. It felt messy. Julian Vance despised messes. "Right," Julian said, stepping away from her touch. "Well, I need to get ready for the board call. Have my driver take you back to Manhattan." "I can work from here today," Vivian suggested, smoothly leaning against the doorframe of the master bedroom. "We have the Tokyo files to review." "No," Julian snapped the word sharper than a blade. Vivian blinked, startled. "I work alone on weekends. My driver will be waiting in 20 minutes. For the next 3 days, Julian operated under the arrogant assumption that Clara would break. He checked his phone periodically, expecting the tearful apology text. He checked the joint bank accounts, expecting to see a charge at a luxury hotel or a high-end spa. Nothing. By the 5th day, the annoyance began to curdle into something colder. He called her cell phone. It went straight to a generic voicemail. He called her friends. None of them had seen her, and their responses were increasingly panicked. He checked the garage. All her cars were there. Her designer bags, her jewelry, her clothes, everything was still perfectly organized in her massive walk-in closet. It was as if she had evaporated into thin air. Julian paced the length of his vast office in Manhattan, the city skyline stretching out below him. He hated feeling out of control. He summoned the head of his private security firm, a stoic former intelligence officer named Vance Security Detail. "Find her," Julian ordered, slamming his hands flat on his mahogany desk. "Check credit cards, passports, hospitals, everything. A heavily pregnant woman does not just vanish without a trace." "Yes, sir," the security head nodded. "And if we locate her—" "You report her location to me immediately," Julian commanded, his silver gray eyes flashing with a possessive territorial anger. "She is carrying my child. No one walks away from me." But as weeks turned into a month, the reports came back empty. Clara had used no credit cards. Her passport had not been scanned. Her medical records had been sealed by a court order that Julian's lawyers couldn't pierce without acknowledging the separation publicly, something Julian refused to do, fearing the hit to Vance Global stock prices. In the absence of Clara's stabilizing presence, the perfect facade of Julian's life began to crack. Vivian, sensing the power vacuum, had seamlessly moved into the penthouse in the city. But she wasn't Clara. She was demanding loud and constantly angling for public recognition. She rearranged the furniture, threw out Clara's understated art, and complained when Julian worked late. She didn't manage his life. She complicated it. Late one night, sitting in the dark, cavernous living room of his penthouse, listening to Vivian complain on the phone about a delayed flight, Julian stared at the empty space on the sofa where Clara used to read. The silence she had left behind was deafening. He had replaced his quiet, devoted wife with a loud, ambitious mistress, and for the first time in his arrogant, calculated life, Julian Vance wondered if he had made a colossal, unforgivable miscalculation. The Pacific Ocean did not whisper like the gentle, manicured surf of the Hamptons. It roared. It crashed against the jagged black rocks of Cape Falcon, Oregon, sending freezing, salty spray high into the mist-shrouded air. For Clara Hayes, the relentless, raw power of the ocean was exactly what she needed. She stood on the small, weathered wooden deck of the modest 2-bedroom cottage she had rented under her maiden name. She was now 36 weeks pregnant. The physical toll of the 3rd trimester was immense, a heavy, dragging exhaustion that seeped deep into her bones. Her ankles were chronically swollen. Her back was a landscape of dull, throbbing aches, and simple tasks like tying her shoes required strategic planning. But as she pulled her thick, oversized wool cardigan tighter around her shivering frame, breathing in the sharp scent of pine needles and sea salt, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in 7 years. She felt completely and utterly free. Here, 3,000 miles away from the glass house and the suffocating expectations of Julian Vance, she was just Clara. She was the quiet woman who visited the local farmer's market on Tuesday mornings, the expectant mother who asked the town librarian for books on child rearing. She wasn't an accessory. She wasn't an inconvenience. She turned and walked slowly back inside, rubbing the small of her back. The cottage was a stark contrast to the sprawling Hamptons estate. There were no marble floors or designer chandeliers, only scuffed hardwood and a cozy, slightly drafty brick fireplace. But it was hers. She made her way to the smaller of the two bedrooms, the nursery. There was no team of interior decorators here. Clara had done it all herself, battling through bouts of profound fatigue. She had painted the walls a soothing, muted seafoam green. In the center of the room sat a sturdy vintage wooden crib she had found at a local antique shop for $50. She had spent a week sanding it down and repainting it by hand, her knuckles raw and aching, but her heart swelling with every brush stroke. She rested her hand on the smooth railing of the crib. The baby Leo shifted heavily inside her, pressing a tiny foot against her ribs. "Not much longer now, my little lion," Clara whispered, a tired but genuine smile touching her lips. "It's not a palace, but it's safe, and it's filled with love. I promise you that." But across the country in the towering glass and steel monolith of Vance Global in Manhattan, the illusion of safety was being actively dismantled. Julian Vance sat at the head of his massive obsidian boardroom table. His jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. Standing at attention before him was the head of his security detail. 30 days, Julian said, his voice dangerously low, echoing in the cavernous room. "You have had 30 days, unlimited resources, and a blank check, and you are telling me you still cannot find my heavily pregnant wife." The security chief swallowed hard. "Sir, Mrs. Vance." "Do not call her that unless you are telling me where she is," Julian snapped, slamming his palm against the table. "Clara," the chief corrected himself hastily, "has been completely off the grid. However, our cyber division did manage to trace a heavily encrypted IP ping from an older laptop she rarely used. It routed through the several VPNs, but we caught a momentary localized slip. It pinged from the Pacific Northwest, specifically the coastal region of Oregon." "Oregon," Julian repeated, his silver gray eyes narrowing in disgust. "Why the hell would she go to a freezing rainy wasteland like Oregon? She hates the cold." "We don't have an exact location, sir," the chief admitted, "just a broad geographic radius. It's a needle in a haystack. There are dozens of small, isolated towns along that coastline." Julian stood up, pacing like a caged animal. He was exhausted, though his fatigue was born of frustration, not the physical labor of creating life. The narrative was spinning out of his control. Board members were whispering. The SEC was asking irritating questions about his sudden distraction. And at the penthouse, Vivian was becoming an unbearable nuisance. Speak of the devil. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open and Vivian strolled in. She was wearing a sharp blood-red designer suit, looking every inch the corporate predator. "Julian, darling," she said, ignoring the security chief. "The caterers for the charity gala need your approval on the menu." "Not now, Vivian," Julian ground out, not looking at her. "I am dealing with a security crisis." Vivian sighed, crossing her arms. She looked at the digital map of the Oregon coast, illuminated on the boardroom screen. "Still chasing ghosts, Julian. It's been a month. She's probably living in a trailer park crying her eyes out. Let her go. You have me." Julian finally turned to her, his expression ice cold. "She is carrying my heir, Vivian, my son. You do not simply let go of a Vance asset. Now get out of my boardroom." Vivian's face flushed with anger and humiliation. She turned on her heel and stormed out her stilettos, clicking sharply against the floor. Back in her own lavishly appointed office, Vivian slammed the door and threw her purse onto the desk. She was furious. She had won the man, but she couldn't exorcise the ghost of his wife. Clara's absence was a louder presence than Vivian's reality. Julian was obsessed. And Vivian knew that if Julian found Clara and the baby, her own tenuous grip on the billionaire lifestyle would be jeopardized. She looked at the note she had snatched from Julian's desk earlier. Asterisk Oregon Coast. Vivian opened her personal laptop. Clara was a nester. She was obsessed with organic foods, holistic health, and community support. If Clara was hiding in a small coastal town heavily pregnant and alone, she would be looking for resources. A cruel, calculated smile spread across Vivian's face. She didn't need a team of highly paid security contractors to find a lonely pregnant housewife. She just needed a little digital bait. In Cape Falcon, Clara was sitting at her small kitchen table, a cup of red raspberry leaf tea cooling beside her. The exhaustion was particularly heavy today, a dull ache radiating from her lower back down her legs. She opened her laptop. She needed to finalize her birth plan and find a local pediatrician who accepted out-of-pocket cash payments. She logged into a private local forum called Asterisk Pacific, Northwest Coastal Moms Asterisk. It had been a lifeline over the past month, a place to ask anonymous questions about local clinics and secondhand baby gear. She clicked on the new members thread to see if anyone had recommended a pediatrician recently. Her eyes scanned the screen and then her heart stopped. The air vanished from her lungs. The physical ache in her back was instantly eclipsed by a sharp, icy spike of pure terror. There at the top of the feed was a new post. Asterisk high, ladies. Relocating to the beautiful Oregon coast soon from NYC with my fiance. He's a finance CEO, very demanding. We are expecting and looking for the absolute best ultra-luxury maternity care in the area. I hear the local clinics are quite basic. Also looking for a specific vintage crib. My partner's ex took ours when she had a mental breakdown and ran away. TIA asterisk. It wasn't just the impossibly cruel specific wording. It was the profile picture attached to the account under the name Vivi_C. It was a picture of Vivian Croft standing on Julian's yacht holding a glass of champagne. Clara slammed the laptop shut as if it were a venomous snake. She shoved her chair back, her breath coming in short panicked gasps. Her hands shook violently as she wrapped her arms around her heavy belly. Asterisk, they found me. The thought echoed in her mind like a death knell. The sanctuary was breached. Vivian was here in the digital space of her small, safe town hunting her. It was a probe, a calculated strike, to see if Clara would panic and run, exposing herself in the process. Clara's first instinct was flight. She needed to pack her bag. She needed to get to her car. She could drive north to Canada. She could disappear again. She grabbed her burner phone, her fingers fumbling over the keys as she dialed Arthur Sterling's direct line. Arthur, Clara gasped the moment he answered. She knows. Vivian knows I'm in Oregon. She posted in my local mom's group. She used her real picture. She's baiting me. Clara, breathe. Arthur's voice was instantaneous, sharp, and commanding. Stop pacing. Sit down. Clara sank onto the worn sofa, burying her face in her free hand. I have to leave Arthur. If Vivian is looking here, Julian's security team is right behind her. I have to pack. No, Arthur barked, the absolute authority in his voice cutting through her panic. You do absolutely nothing, Clara. Do not run. But they... Listen to me, Arthur interrupted, his tone softening, but remaining firm. This is a fishing expedition. If they knew exactly where you were, Julian wouldn't be sending his mistress to troll maternity message boards. He would have a fleet of black SUVs parked on your lawn with emergency custody papers. Clara closed her eyes, trying to force oxygen into her tight lungs. You think she's acting alone? I guarantee it, Arthur said. Julian is arrogant, but he's not sloppy. Vivian is acting out of desperation to secure her place. She knows Julian is obsessed with finding the heir. She's throwing a rock into the bushes to see if you flush out. It's terrifying, Arthur, Clara whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. The exhaustion of hiding, of carrying this heavy burden alone, was threatening to crush her. I'm so tired. I know you are, Clara, Arthur said gently, but running now is the worst thing you can do. You are 36 weeks pregnant. You need medical stability. You have established residency under Clara Hayes. The offshore funds are secure. If you run, you create a trail. You become the unstable, erratic woman Julian wants the courts to believe you are. Clara looked across the small room, through the open door of the nursery at the little wooden crib she had sanded with her own bleeding hands. She had built this. She had earned this peace. Why should she be the one to run? A slow, simmering spark of defiance ignited in Clara's chest, pushing back the cold tide of fear. She placed both hands firmly on her belly. Leo kicked back a strong, reassuring thump. Okay, Clara said, her voice dropping, the tremor settling into a hard, quiet resolve. I won't run. Good, Arthur said, the pride evident in his voice. Delete your account on that forum. Wipe your browser history. Lock your doors and keep your head down. We are in the end game now, Clara. The moment that baby is born, we stop hiding. We go on the offensive. Clara hung up the phone. She looked out the window at the roaring Pacific Ocean. She was done being the victim. She was done being terrified of the storm. Let them come. When the time was right, she would be the one to bring the lightning. The storm that welcomed Leo into the world was as fierce and unrelenting as the one that had masked his mother's escape. At exactly 39 weeks in the dead of a freezing rain-lashed Oregon night, Clara's water broke. There was no panic, only a deep settling calm. She had packed her hospital bag weeks ago. She called the local cab company, her voice steady, between the tightening grips of her contractions, and walked out of the little cottage, locking the door behind her. The small coastal hospital was quiet, a stark contrast to the sprawling, sterile VIP maternity suites of Manhattan where Julian had planned to parade his heir. Here the walls were painted a soft, faded yellow, and the nurses spoke with genuine warmth, unbothered by the lack of a billionaire's last name on her chart. She was registered simply as Clara Hayes. The labor was grueling. For 14 agonizing hours, Clara fought a battle of pure endurance. Her body, already depleted from months of physical and emotional exhaustion, was pushed to the absolute edge of its limits. There were moments in the sterile, brightly lit delivery room where the pain was so blinding, so all-consuming that she felt she might simply shatter. She had no husband to hold her hand. She had no family pacing the waiting room. She had only the rhythmic beep of the fetal monitor and the sheer, unbroken will to protect the child fighting his way into the world. "You're doing beautifully, Clara," the attending doctor, a kind-eyed woman named Dr. Evans, encouraged. "One more big push, he's right here." Clara gripped the rails of the hospital bed, her knuckles turning white. She squeezed her eyes shut, drawing on a reservoir of strength she never knew she possessed. She thought of the glass house. She thought of Vivian's mocking smile. She thought of Julian's cold, arrogant dismissal. She gathered all the pain, the betrayal, and the terror of the last few months, and she pushed. A sharp, piercing cry shattered the quiet room. Clara collapsed back onto the pillows, her chest heaving, tears of absolute exhaustion and profound relief streaming down her sweat-slicked face. "It's a boy," Dr. Evans smiled gently, wiping the infant before wrapping him in a soft, heated blanket. "A perfect, healthy baby boy." The nurse stepped forward and placed a small, heavy bundle onto Clara's bare chest. In that single suspended moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist. The exhaustion that had weighed Clara down for nearly a year vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, fierce tidal wave of pure love. She looked down at her son. He had a shock of thick, dark hair slick against his tiny head. He stopped crying the moment he felt the warmth of her skin opening his eyes to look up at her. Clara's breath hitched. Looking back at her were two striking, unmistakable silver-gray eyes. Julian's eyes. And there, resting just above the delicate curve of his left collarbone, was a faint reddish crescent-shaped birthmark. The Vance mark. A genetic stamp of a lineage that stretched back generations. He was the hidden heir, undeniably and perfectly formed, but he belonged solely to her. "Hello, Leo," Clara whispered, her voice cracking with emotion as she pressed a trembling kiss to his warm forehead. "I'm your mama, and I will never, ever let anyone hurt you." She held him for an hour, memorizing every line of his face, the tiny weight of him a grounding anchor to her new reality. When Leo finally fell asleep, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, Clara reached for the burner phone on the bedside table. She dialed Arthur Sterling's number. He answered on the first ring. "He's here, Arthur," Clara said, her voice a mixture of exhaustion and unbreakable steel. "His name is Leo Hayes." On the other end of the line, Arthur let out a long, heavy exhale. "Congratulations, Clara. I am so incredibly happy for you. Is he healthy? Are you okay?" "We are perfect," Clara replied, looking down at her sleeping son. She stroked the tiny crescent birthmark on his collarbone. "The waiting is over, Arthur. Execute the plan." "With pleasure," Arthur said, his voice turning deadly cold. "I'll make the call right now. Rest well, Clara. By the time you wake up, Julian Vance will understand exactly who he went to war with." 3,000 miles away, the morning sun was glaring off the glass facade of Vance Global Headquarters in Manhattan. Julian Vance sat at the head of the obsidian boardroom table, projecting an aura of absolute dominance. Around him sat a dozen senior executives and the managing partners of a massive Japanese tech conglomerate. They were in the final agonizing hours of closing a multi-billion-dollar merger. The air in the room was thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee. Julian was exhausted, but his fatigue was fueled by caffeine anger and the relentless pressure of holding his empire together, while his personal life bled out in the shadows. It had been nearly 2 months since Clara vanished. The whispering among his board of directors had grown from a murmur to a distinct hum of concern. A CEO who couldn't locate his own pregnant wife was a CEO exhibiting a concerning lack of control. To make matters worse, Vivian was currently sitting 2 chairs down from him, aggressively interjecting herself into the negotiations. She was trying to play the dual role of sharp corporate director and Julian's partner, and she was failing at both. Her aggressive tactics were alienating the conservative Japanese executives, and Julian had to repeatedly correct her, his temper fraying with every interruption.
As I was saying, Julian stated, shooting a warning glare at Vivian that made her snap her mouth shut. Vance Global was prepared to guarantee the supply chain logistics for the next 5 quarters.
The heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom suddenly swung open, interrupting him mid-sentence. Julian's silver gray eyes flashed with fury. I explicitly ordered no interruptions, he barked at his executive assistant, who was hovering nervously in the hallway. But the assistant wasn't the one entering the room. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped into the boardroom. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and an air of absolute unbothered confidence. He bypassed the security detail at the door as if they were statues. "Mr. Julian Vance," the man said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent, stunned room. "Who the hell are you?" Julian demanded, standing up, his hands planted flat on the table. "Security removed this man immediately." The man didn't flinch. He walked straight toward the head of the table. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents bound in a blue backing. With a precise, deliberate motion, he slapped the documents down onto the polished obsidian table directly in front of Julian. "I am a court-appointed process server," the man stated calmly. "Julian Vance, you have been formally served." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The Japanese executives exchanged confused, alarmed glances. Vivienne stood up, her face pale.
"Served with what?" Julian demanded, staring at the stack of papers as if it were a live explosive.
"A petition for divorce on the grounds of adultery," the process server recited loud enough for every single person in the room to hear. "An emergency ex parte order granting temporary sole, physical, and legal custody of the minor child Leo Hayes to the petitioner, and a restraining order barring you from coming within 1,000 feet of Clara Hayes or the child." The words hit Julian like a physical barrage. Asterisk divorce, adultery, sole custody. But the word that paralyzed him, the word that made the blood drain entirely from his face, was the name. Asterisk Leo, asterisk. His hands began to shake slightly. He looked down at the top sheet of the documents. It was heavily stamped by the family court. He saw the jurisdiction printed boldly at the top, asterisk State of Oregon. He flipped the first page. Attached was a copy of a birth certificate.
Asterisk name of child Leo Hayes. Asterisk mother Clara Hayes. Asterisk father undisclosed.
Julian felt the floor drop out from beneath him. He couldn't breathe. The air in the boardroom had turned to vacuum.
She hadn't just run away. She hadn't been hiding in a motel crying over his betrayal. Clara had been strategizing. She had intentionally waited, hiding herself in a completely different jurisdiction, letting the clock run out until the child was born. By establishing residency in Oregon and giving birth there, she had trapped him. The Oregon courts had jurisdiction over the child now. And by filing an emergency order based on his documented infidelity and the hostile environment of their home, she had legally severed his rights before he even knew his son existed.
She hadn't given the boy the Vance name. She had named him Leo, the name he had mocked.
"This is insane," Vivian hissed, stepping forward and reaching for the papers. "She can't do this. You have the best lawyers in New York."
"Don't touch them," Julian roared, slapping her hand away with a violent motion that made everyone in the room flinch. He stared at the birth certificate, his arrogant facade completely shattering. He had spent his entire life treating people like chess pieces, moving them, discarding them, controlling the board. He thought Clara was a pawn, an easily managed asset that had simply fallen off the table. He realized with a sickening, dizzying jolt that Clara hadn't just flipped the board. She had burned it to the ground.
He had a son he had never seen, a son who didn't bear his name. And according to the legal fortress Clara and Arthur Sterling had built, Julian Vance had absolutely no legal right to ever see him.
The process server turned and walked out of the room, leaving Julian standing in the wreckage of his empire, staring at the name of the hidden heir he had lost before he ever had a chance to know him. The legal war that followed was brutal. A scorched earth campaign funded by Julian Vance's seemingly bottomless bank accounts. Humiliated and enraged by Clara's tactical masterpiece, Julian hired the most vicious family law firm in Manhattan, led by a ruthless bulldog of an attorney named Harrison Brentwood. Their strategy was simple and cruel. Bleed Clara dry and paint her as an unstable, hysterical woman who had kidnapped a billionaire's child in a fit of postpartum psychosis. They filed motion after motion. They subpoenaed Clara's college roommates, her old doctors, and even the landlord of her Oregon cottage. They demanded psychological evaluations and immediate DNA testing, framing the request with language designed to make Clara look like a flight risk and a danger to her own son. But Arthur Sterling was a fortress. For every motion Brentwood filed, Arthur had a counter motion heavily fortified with irrefutable evidence. He shielded Clara from the worst of the legal shrapnel, allowing her to focus entirely on the grueling, beautiful reality of being a new mother. And Clara was exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that settled into the marrow of her bones. Leo was a demanding baby prone to colic in the early weeks. Clara spent her nights pacing the small nursery, bouncing him gently, surviving on 2-hour intervals of fragmented sleep. She had dark circles under her eyes. Her hair was often tied in a messy practical knot, and she wore comfortable, faded nursing shirts instead of designer silk. Yet beneath the staggering fatigue, there was a core of impenetrable steel. Every time she looked at Leo, every time his tiny fingers curled around hers, the exhaustion was entirely eclipsed by a fierce, primal surge of protective love. She was a mother lion standing over her cub. Julian Vance and his expensive lawyers could throw all the mud they wanted. They would not break her. The preliminary hearing was scheduled exactly 2 months after Leo's birth. Due to the active restraining order and the extreme geographic distance, the judge mandated a virtual hearing via a secure video conference. It was a cold, clinical format for a battle that would decide the fate of a family. Clara sat at a heavy wooden table in a borrowed law office in downtown Portland, Oregon. Arthur sat beside her, radiating a calm, lethal confidence. Clara wore a simple navy blue blouse. She wore no makeup to hide her fatigue. She had nothing to hide. Resting in a plush bassinet on the table just out of the camera's frame was Leo sleeping peacefully after a morning feeding. On the large monitor in front of them, the screen was divided into squares. In one square sat the judge, Honorable Margaret Rossi, a stern, sharp-eyed woman who had seen every trick in the family court playbook. In the other square was Julian Vance.
Clara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach as she saw him for the first time in nearly a year. He was sitting in a high-tech sterile conference room in Manhattan, flanked by Harrison Brentwood and 2 junior associates. Julian looked impeccably tailored in a dark bespoke suit, his silver gray eyes hard and calculating. But Clara noticed the subtle changes. He looked thinner. The arrogant set of his jaw was tight, masking a deep simmering stress. Sitting slightly behind him, visible just at the edge of the frame, was Vivian Croft, trying to project an air of supportive superiority. The hearing began. Harrison Brentwood immediately went on the offensive. Your Honor, Brentwood boomed, his voice filling the room. We are here to correct a gross miscarriage of justice. My client, Mr. Julian Vance, is a pillar of the business community. He has been subjected to a malicious, calculated kidnapping by his estranged wife. Miss Hayes vanished without warning, concealing her pregnancy and entirely depriving my client of his fundamental rights as a father. We are requesting immediate unsupervised visitation and a psychological evaluation of the mother, who is clearly exhibiting erratic, unstable behavior.
Judge Rossi peered over her reading glasses, her expression unreadable. She turned her attention to the square containing Clara and Arthur.
Mr. Sterling, the judge prompted.
Arthur adjusted his suit jacket and leaned into the microphone. His voice was smooth, deadly, and entirely devoid of theatrics.
Your Honor, there was no kidnapping. There was an evacuation, Arthur stated clearly. My client fled a deeply toxic and psychologically abusive environment to protect her unborn child. She left her marital home only after discovering her husband engaging in a sexual affair in their home with his subordinate, Miss Vivian Croft, who I might note is inappropriately present in Mr. Vance's screen today.
Julian's jaw clenched visibly. He shot a furious glare at Brentwood, who quickly signaled for Vivian to move out of the frame.
Furthermore, Arthur continued his tone hardening. Miss Hayes did not act erratically. She acted defensively. We have submitted evidence to the court Exhibit C, which clearly shows Miss Croft actively stalking my client on localized maternity message boards in Oregon, just weeks before the birth, attempting to bait her into exposing her location using a fake profile. It was a targeted campaign of harassment orchestrated by the very people claiming my client is unstable.
Judge Rossi's brow furrowed. She shuffled through the papers on her desk, locating Exhibit C. She read it in silence for a long moment. When she looked back up at Julian's screen, her eyes were ice cold.
Mr. Vance, the judge said sharply, is it your habit to employ your paramour to harass your pregnant wife across state lines?
Julian opened his mouth, his face flushing a dark, angry red. Your Honor, I had absolutely no knowledge of that forum post. Vivian acted entirely on her own.
Save it for the trial, Mr. Vance, the judge cut him off sharply. This court does not look kindly on stalking disguised as concern. However, paternity has not been legally established. I have the birth certificate here listing the father as undisclosed. Before I rule on any temporary visitation or mandatory DNA testing, I want to see the child. I want visual confirmation of the infant's well being in the mother's care.
Arthur nodded to Clara. Clara took a deep, steadying breath. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached down into the bassinet. She lifted Leo, gently supporting his head, and brought him up into the frame of the webcam. The entire video conference seemed to hold its breath. Leo was awake now. He wasn't crying. He was simply looking around with wide, observant eyes. He was wearing a soft, simple white cotton onesie. As Clara adjusted him in her arms, the collar of the onesie shifted, exposing the delicate skin of his left collarbone. On the screen, Julian Vance leaned forward. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire froze. The breath completely left his lungs in a sudden, sharp hiss that was caught by his microphone. It was as if looking into a mirror that reached into the past and the future simultaneously. Leo had a thick shock of dark hair exactly like Julian's, but it was the eyes that stopped Julian's heart. Looking back at him through the digital feed were two striking, piercing silver gray eyes. They were not Clara's soft blue. They were his. Undeniably, fiercely his. And then Julian's gaze dropped to the child's collarbone. There, resting perfectly against the pale skin, was a distinct reddish crescent-shaped birthmark. Julian's hand flew to his own collar, right below the knot of his silk tie where an identical mark lay hidden beneath his shirt. It was the Vance mark, the genetic stamp that his father had and his grandfather before him. The absolute reality of what he had done, of what he had lost, hit Julian with the force of a freight train. This wasn't a corporate asset. This wasn't a chess piece. This was his flesh and blood. This was a perfect living, breathing piece of himself. A son he had thrown away for a cheap thrill in a sunroom. Julian choked out. The polished, commanding CEO voice was gone. In its place was the raw, broken rasp of a devastated man. Julian tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat like broken glass. His hands resting on the mahogany table began to tremble violently. He stared at the screen, his silver gray eyes filling with rapid, uncontrollable tears. That's my son, Julian stammered, his voice cracking a wet, gasping sound that echoed painfully through the audio feed. He pushed himself closer to the monitor, his fingers reaching out to trace the cold glass of the screen as if he could somehow touch the baby. Clara, please. He has my eyes. He has the mark. He's my boy. Clara looked at him through the screen. She saw the tears spilling over Julian's eyelashes, ruining his flawless facade in front of his lawyers and the judge. She saw the utter desperate breakdown of the man who had once told her she was acting hysterical. But Clara felt no triumph. She only felt a deep, exhausted sorrow for the family that could have been and a fierce, unyielding determination to protect what was left. She held Leo closer to her chest, her chin lifting in an exhausted but regal posture of absolute defiance. She did not speak. She let the silence and the undeniable image of the hidden heir answer him. Your Honor, Julian begged, turning his tear-streaked face to the camera, completely ignoring Harrison Brentwood, who was frantically trying to mute his client's microphone. Please look at him. I am his father. I didn't know. I didn't understand. I have to see him. I have to hold my son. The desperation in Julian's voice was guttural, the agonizing wail of a man realizing he was locked outside the gates of heaven entirely by his own doing. Judge Rossi watched Julian's breakdown with a stoic expression, her face softening only slightly when she looked back at Clara and the baby. The physical resemblance is certainly noted for the record, Judge Rossi said calmly, her voice slicing through Julian's quiet sobs. DNA testing will commence immediately to formalize paternity.
However, given the evidence of hostility, the stalking of the mother, and the geographic distance, my ruling remains firm. The mother, Clara Hayes, retains a temporary sole physical and legal custody.
Julian let out a choked gasp, burying his face in his hands. Mr. Vance, the judge continued, her tone merciless. You will be granted exactly 1 hour of supervised virtual visitation per week, monitored by a court appointed social worker. You will not approach the mother. You will not travel to Oregon. If you violate this order, you will lose those virtual privileges entirely. We will reconvene in 90 days for a full custody trial. The gavel came down with a sharp final crack. The squares on the screen began to blink out. Clara reached over and ended the call. The monitor went black, cutting off the image of the weeping billionaire. The silence in the borrowed law office was profound. Clara sat perfectly still, holding Leo, feeling the steady rhythmic beating of his tiny heart against her chest. The exhaustion was still there, but the fear was gone.
She had brought the lightning, and Julian Vance was burning in the ashes.
The 90 days leading up to the final custody trial were an agonizing purgatory for Julian Vance.
His life, once a flawlessly orchestrated symphony of power and control, had devolved into a pathetic countdown to a 60-minute window on a Thursday afternoon. That was his court-ordered, supervised virtual visitation. For 1 hour a week, the billionaire CEO would lock the doors to his office, ignore the frantic calls from his board of directors, and stare at a high-definition monitor, desperate for a glimpse of the son he was forbidden to touch.
The visits were a unique form of psychological torture. Often, Leo would be sleeping a tiny, peaceful bundle in his crib, oblivious to the man weeping silently on the other side of the screen. Sometimes Leo would be awake fussing, and Clara's hands, only her hands, as she refused to show her face, would reach into the frame to soothe him, adjusting his blanket or offering a bottle. Look at the camera. Leo, Julian would whisper, his voice raspy, his silver gray eyes red-rimmed. It's Daddy, I'm right here. I'm coming for you, I promise. But the screen offered no warmth, no scent of baby powder, no weight of a child in his arms. It was a digital ghost of the family he had slaughtered on the altar of his own ego. At the penthouse, the atmosphere had turned toxic. Vivian Croft, realizing that Julian's obsession with Clara and the hidden heir was entirely eclipsing his interest in her, grew increasingly bitter. She had signed up to be the glamorous wife of a titan, not the ignored roommate of a broken, grieving man. The breaking point arrived 2 weeks before the final trial date. Instead of a courtroom, Arthur Sterling requested a private settlement conference in a neutral, highly secure boardroom in downtown Portland. Clara was not present. She was at the cottage taking Leo for a walk along the beach, breathing in the ocean air. She trusted Arthur completely. Julian flew in on his private jet, accompanied by Harrison Brentwood. Julian looked terrible. The bespoke suit hung loosely on his diminished frame. His face was gray, the arrogant fire in his eyes entirely extinguished, replaced by a desperate, hollow hunger. Let's make this quick, Sterling, Brentwood barked as they sat down. My client is prepared to offer a $50 million trust for the child full ownership of the Hamptons estate to Miss Hayes and a guaranteed 50-50 split of physical custody. It is a more than generous offer. Arthur Sterling didn't even look at the proposal. Brentwood slid across the table. He leaned back in his leather chair, a chilling, predatory calm radiating from him. We are not here to negotiate custody, Harrison, Arthur said smoothly. Clara retains sole legal and physical custody. Mr. Vance will be permitted 4 supervised visits a year in Oregon at his own expense. That is non-negotiable. Julian slammed his fist onto the table. You cannot keep my son from me. I have money. I have the best legal team in the country. I will fight you in court until the day I die.
You won't make it to court, Julian, Arthur replied, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet register.
Arthur opened his sleek briefcase. He didn't pull out family court documents. He pulled out a single thick manila folder and slid it across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of Julian. When Clara managed your household, she was meticulous. Arthur began watching Julian's face carefully. She organized your private files, your taxes, your personal accounts. A year before she left, she noticed a series of highly complex, incredibly well-hidden wire transfers, routing from Vance Global's corporate accounts into offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Shell companies, it turns out, that were registered under the maiden name of your current director of acquisitions, Miss Vivian Croft. Julian's breath hitched. The remaining color drained from his face. Harrison Brentwood frowned, looking sharply at his client.
corporate embezzlement, tax evasion, and defrauding your shareholders to fund a secret life with your mistress. Arthur listed the crimes as casually as if he were reading a grocery list. It took my forensic accountants 8 months to untangle the web, but the paper trail is absolute. Clara took photographs of the internal ledgers the night she left.
This is blackmail, Brentwood hissed, though his voice lacked its usual booming confidence. This is leverage, Arthur corrected coldly. If we go to trial for custody, I am legally obligated to submit these financial records to demonstrate Mr. Vance's lack of moral character and unstable environment. Those records become public. By noon the next day, the SEC and the Department of Justice will be kicking down the doors of Vance Global. You will lose your company, Julian. You will lose your fortune. And you will go to federal prison. You won't just lose custody of Leo, you will lose your freedom. The silence in the room was absolute heavy as a gravestone. Julian stared at the manila folder. His hands trembled violently. The empire he had built, the wealth he had used as a weapon to control Clara, was now the very noose around his neck. Clara had held the detonator this entire time, and she had simply waited for him to walk into the blast zone. What are your terms? Julian whispered, his voice completely broken. The king had officially fallen. Sign the custody agreement, Arthur said, sliding the divorce and custody papers forward. You surrender. You leave Clara and Leo in peace. You pay the court-ordered child support. In exchange, this folder remains sealed in my vault. Julian didn't look at his lawyer. He didn't argue. With a shaking hand, he picked up the pen and signed his name, severing his rights, his control, and his future with his son. When Julian returned to the Manhattan penthouse that night, a shattered, empty shell of a man, he found the closets half empty. Vivian was standing in the foyer, zipping up a Louis Vuitton suitcase.
I got a call from Brentwood's associate, Vivian said, not looking at him. Her voice was ice cold. You signed away half your liquid assets, and the board is holding an emergency meeting tomorrow because of rumors regarding your mental fitness. The stock is tanking, Julian.
Julian looked at her, feeling absolutely nothing. Where are you going? To London, she replied, curtly, slipping on her sunglasses despite it being midnight. I'm young, I'm smart. I'm not going down with a sinking ship because you couldn't get over your runaway wife. Goodbye, Julian. The heavy penthouse door clicked shut behind her. Julian stood alone in the dark, cavernous living room. The silence was deafening. He had traded a devoted wife and a beautiful son for a woman who abandoned him the second the gold lost its shine. He fell to his knees on the cold marble floor, buried his face in his hands, and wept until his throat bled. 6 months later, the Oregon sun was surprisingly warm for late autumn, casting a golden glow over the small, fenced-in garden of Clara's cottage. Clara sat on a wooden bench, wearing a comfortable knitted sweater, her hair blowing gently in the ocean breeze. Beside her, standing on wobbly, chubby legs and clinging to the bench for support, was Leo. He was 10 months old now, a bright, laughing child with a mop of dark hair and striking, observant, silver-gray eyes. A sleek black town car pulled up to the curb outside the white picket fence. Clara's posture straightened slightly, but her face remained serene. She watched as the court-appointed social worker stepped out, followed by a man who looked like a ghost of Julian Vance. Julian opened the wooden gate slowly. He was wearing a simple sweater and jeans clothes he would have scoffed at a year ago. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a hesitant, agonizingly slow shuffle. He looked older, humbled, stripped entirely to his bones. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes locked onto Leo.
He's standing, Julian breathed, his voice thick with unshed tears. He started pulling himself up last week, Clara said. Her voice was not cruel, but it was incredibly guarded. A boundary made of iron.
Clara, Julian whispered, looking at her, his eyes begging for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. You look beautiful. You look happy. I am, she replied simply, and it was the absolute truth. Julian slowly crouched down to Leo's eye level. He held out a trembling hand. Hi, Leo. It's Julian. Can I? He looked at Clara for permission. Clara gave a single tight nod. Julian reached out and gently touched Leo's tiny hand. Leo didn't cry, but he didn't smile either. He just stared at the strange, sad man with his own silver-gray eyes, then turned away, burying his face in Clara's sweater. A choked sob escaped Julian's lips. The physical pain of his son treating him like a stranger was worse than anything the lawyers or the boardroom had inflicted upon him. He had missed the first smile, the first laugh, the first steps. He had missed the foundation. He was just a visitor in a life he was supposed to lead. I'm sorry, Julian wept, his head bowed, the tears falling freely onto the Oregon grass. I am so, so sorry, Clara, for everything. I destroyed it. I destroyed my own world. Clara looked down at the broken billionaire at her feet. She felt a pang of pity, but the love that had once tied her to him was completely gone, washed away by the storm and replaced by the overwhelming love she held for her son. You did, Julian, Clara said softly, her voice carrying the finality of a closing door. But you didn't destroy mine. You just forced me to build a better one. She stood up, lifting Leo into her arms. The baby instantly babbled, wrapping his arms around her neck, burying his face in the crook of her shoulder. Your hour is up, Julian, Clara said.
She didn't look back as she turned and walked toward the cottage. She walked out of the shadows of the billionaire's regrets and stepped fully into the bright, warm sunlight of her own freedom. She was no longer a victim. She was Clara Hayes, a mother, a survivor, a queen of her own quiet, beautiful kingdom.
And as the door closed behind her, Julian Vance was left alone in the yard, kneeling in the dirt, finally understanding the true cost of the things he had thrown away. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk.
Clara's journey is a breathtaking testament to the unspoken strength of a mother. She walked away from $1 billion empire with nothing but the clothes on her back to protect her unborn child, and in the end, she outsmarted the very man who thought she was powerless. Julian Vance learned the hardest lesson of all, that true wealth isn't found in bank accounts or boardrooms, but in the loyalty and love of a family, a treasure he recognized only after it was permanently out of his reach.
What did you think of Clara's brilliant revenge? Do you think Julian's heartbreak at the end was enough justice for what he put her through, or did he deserve worse? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
If Clara's story of resilience, motherhood, and ultimate karma moved you, please hit that like button. Share this video and make sure to subscribe for more incredible emotional stories of hidden truths and poetic justice. Thank you so much for watching.